welcome you to this second meeting of the year for monitoring and operations for 8th of June. Currently attending on Zoom we have Councillor Thompson and Councillor Love. Are they online, Shari? Cool. Just before we commence, I'd just like to remind councillors that the public section of this meeting is being recorded and will be available on the Bay of Plenty Regional Council website following the meeting and archived for a period of 3 years. To those members of the public here today, all care will be taken to maintain your privacy. However, as a visitor in the public gallery, your presence may be recorded. By remaining in the public gallery, it is understood your consent is given if your image is inadvertently broadcast. I also remind all present that the local government decision making affords no protection to councillors, council officers and the public for comments made during these meetings that are subsequently challenged in a court of law and determined to be slanderous. On that note, welcome along. Currently I have apologies from Councillor Thurston, Councillor Eaty and Councillor Rose for lateness. Would somebody like to move apologies be accepted? Councillor Von Delson, seconded by Councillor Nees. All those in favour please say aye. Aye. Against carried. There's no public forum, there's no further items on the agenda that's not already in our paper. The order of business will be as present. There's any declarations of conflict of interest. I don't believe there are any, and any public excluded business to be transferred into the open, there are none. We'll move straight on to item 7, which are the minutes of the previous meeting held on the March the 9th. Would somebody like to move there be a true and correct record? Who was present there, please? Councillor Crosby, seconded by Councillor Norm Running. Any discussion on the minutes of 9th of March? Thank you, Shari, for a very comprehensive minute taking. Any matters arising? No, I'll put the resolution that the minutes be confirmed. All those in favour please say aye. Aye. Those against, motion is carried. Moving on to Chair's report. This is on page 22. Morning to Talu.
Morning, mate.
Right. Shari, just on the first one there for the fresh water, there was a, at the Rangitoki River Forum last week, there was a presentation from Kelly somebody,
Hughes. Yep.
I'm just wondering, that was a very comprehensive report on barriers to fish passage in the Bay of Plenty, and I'm just wondering if we have it at the next, invite him to our next monitoring and ops committee, because I can't remember the figure, there's either 20,000 or 200,000 barriers to fish across our region in terms of culverts and the like. Can you organise him to come for a presentation? Because I thought it was very pertinent for the whole of council to see that presentation, not just the Rangitoki River catchment issues. So, happy with that. So, Chair's report, open for discussion. Sarah, is anything you want to add to that?
Through you, Chair, no, nothing to add, but just to emphasise, you'll see that there's the update on the water shortage event.
Oh, yes.
Despite the rain that we have had.
We haven't had.
There is continued concern about us going into a relatively warm winter with lower than average rainfalls. We have our standing and operating procedure for water shortage events, which Council approved 18 months ago, and that's what we have been working to. But you delegated the Chief Executive to make those decisions just for that 18 months. So we will come back to the Strategy and Policy Committee with a new revised SOP based on our learnings from the last 2 summers, and look at further delegations for decision making, because it's we will continue these dry weather events.
Yeah. And I note Lake Taupo is 0.1 above its benchmark because of low rainfall right across the central North Island. 0.1 is incredibly low for that lake. Any other items on the chair's report?
Through the chair, yeah,
Yes.
just what the unit inspector Kelly used before. He has basically a fortnightly report that comes out in that space that I get a copy of.
Oh.
So I can
Yep,
ask him to copy you in.
yep, yep, please. But I'd still like him to present too.
Yes, yeah. I actually work with them on occasion on fish patterns, barriers.
And Councillor Von Danielson, you'll see 2.3 project update on marae across the region. Tauranga and Western Bays are proceeding ahead. I think they got a lot of money from, which fund was it? Jobs for Nature, or to proceed with all those. So that's really good progress to see that. And any other items for discussion in the chair's report? No?
Just on the that 2.3 there, the Tauranga Marae, but it should really say Tauranga and Western Bay Marae.
Yeah, I figured.
But I think it's, congratulations to those councils for the work they're doing there. We've talked about these things for a lot of years, and they're not easy to resolve, but the specific work that those councils, and especially Western Bay Council, I think, in connecting up marae where they can with sewage systems and their own solutions where that's not, is very commendable. And getting central government funding to assist them is a real step forward.
And I think also for ourselves, Norm, processing the resource consents for offset systems free of charge. I mean, we've all got to be in this same journey together, so we're playing our part as well. So it's good to see. Councillor Crosby?
Yeah, just on that same subject, I think we should also become more familiar with the $3.8 billion housing stimulus money, that a portion of that, which has been announced, is going to go to Papakainga. And so the connection to this issue and that is very strong. So I hope those councils are aware of the potential opportunity there as well, in terms of the sizing and design of the connections.
And Sarah, commissioner dates for the generic consent date. The commissioner's been announced yet? Because there was one of the staff things last meeting was to identify commissioners, or the process for appointing commissioners for the generic consent. Has that been done yet?
My commissioner has been appointed, and the date for the hearing hasn't been set yet.
Okay. Right. Chairperson's report has been, I'll move that it be received. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Von Danielson. Any further discussion? I'll put that resolution. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, motion is carried. Thank you for that. Moving on to page 33, Mount Wanganui Industrial Airshed Update. 6 exceedances so far this year. 3 of them were from the airport. Correct, yes. And this morning we have Reese and Stephen. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd just like to introduce Rita Martin, our Senior Regulatory Product Officer at Contaminated Land.
Oh, good morning, Rita. Welcome along. You have
I'll take the report as read. Any questions?
Yep. Any questions? Gosh. Councillor Brunning.
Well, the numbers look good, and they're coming down.
Thank you.
Does that reflect that we are making progress?
Through the Chair, I'd like to say yes, we are making progress. We see a number of the large players in the mount sort of picking up the mount, so to speak, and introducing them, and doing their own investigations and kind of getting their own operations in order. So I think we are making a difference in that respect.
And especially with that one at the airport, you know, over those 3 consecutive nights, staff were on the scene pretty much straight away through the early hours of the morning when it was going off. that's commendable in terms of onto it straight away, see what the issues are, and contractors should be slapped around the ears for doing such a thing. But anyway, it is what it is. But good to see staff out and about, no matter what the time of day is. Councillor Mati Moana.
Just a brief update, the meetings that Cora and I attend, the Melbourne Air Quality.
Yep. Yes.
I think it's been of benefit having the industry sitting around the table with councils. So the last meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, I think it's the went well. I think there's still a level of frustration though from some of the female. And I just wanted to see progress from their perspective, but I think the realisation of this being quite a long process to achieve the solutions that we're all wanting to see. So I think we will continue to see a level of frustration on their part in these meetings as well.
And yes, and from a Rotorua perspective, Mati Moana, the air quality working party out there has been working for 15 years to bring down the air sentences from Rotorua from 35 a year down to 1 last year. It's a long-term game, so it is not going to be solved in a couple of years. But when you've got all the parties around the table, everybody gets involved, and it's part of educating our communities as well. Some people in Rotorua are still in denial that smoky chimneys cause a problem over there after 15 years. So, yep, it's everybody's in the same room, which is really good. So I'm really pleased with the progress so far. But yes, it's not going to be solved in the next couple of years. Councillor White.
Yeah, look, just last week I did a 3-hour tour of Balance.
Oh yeah.
And I guess I would confess to being somewhat sceptical sometimes, but I was impressed actually by their attempts to make the change, and the reduction particularly of the SO2 from 90% consent level to 40 voluntarily, and those sorts of things were impressive really. Were they really doing it? Yes, in the tour that I saw. They were well done in their part right now. I mean, there's still a ways to go, and I think the communication with Law needs to continue. But I thought they were doing a very good job. I valued the tour also.
They're taking their role seriously. The amount of money they've spent on that site, yes, it's a lot of money. They've got a way to go too, but it's part of it. We're all in this together. Any further discussion? Oh, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Look, just a word of caution. So on page 35, 2.2, investigating a managed retreat of industry. I just think that staff ought to be very, very careful how some of this narrative is presented, because you can't be seen to adopting a position just because Aroa Moana Advisory Group had a recommendation from their advisory group that this be investigated. This is a very complex issue, involves more than the regional council, involves planning in terms of the local authority, and I think you've just got to be very careful that we don't, not seem to be having an opinion one way or the other in terms of this body of work, because ultimately you might have a group of consultants turn up with a report. Someone's going to be asked to make a judgment based around legal issues as opposed to motive issues.
Anything else? Nothing, no other questions? Right, there's a report there. We've got a list of all the consents coming up on page 39 in terms of applications. And, oh, there was an issue, it's probably been around a while, Reece or Stephen, the black dust in the Mount Maunganui area. Can you just comment on what that is? It's just...
For you, the chair, there's a meeting this Friday in regional where we have the Honourable Simon Bridges coming in with 2 complainants regarding the issue.
Yep.
So a few of us may remember it's been around for a while, I'd say probably 10 to 12 years, where we've got this black dust issue sort of affecting the residents of the Mount area. It tends to be that it's kind of set on outdoor furniture and windowsills. So they wanted to come in and just discuss it with us, and we've got Shane Mainlander from Science coming to that meeting as well as part and the port. The issue is the investigations that we've made. It's a accumulation of natural dust, vehicle emissions and such. But the residents feel as though it's increasing. You know, as the port maybe increased in size or industries increased in size in the Mount. So we're just going to discuss that around the table on Friday.
It's nothing new though, is it?
No, I don't. It's an issue that seems to come to light every few years for us, as maybe there's changes within residential areas of the Mount. New people move in, they're unaware of what it is, and we tend to have to kind of educate a little bit, just show them the science behind it, and sort of let them know what's leading to the issue.
Councillor Bryant?
So following on from that, are all ships coming into the harbour now using diesel oil rather than bunker fuel?
The Marple agreement, is it still voluntary, Bruce? So it's a voluntary agreement with it rather than being legislation at the moment, but they are not burning the heavy fuel oil, they're burning the lighter diesel fuel when they're at port. That's why we've had a significant reduction in the SO2 level.
So when does it become mandatory?
I might have to get back to you with that date. I believe it's kind of has to pass through a parliamentary kind of function rather than it being like obviously a local decision. So that's probably, there's a lot happening right now.
Yeah, I think 2023 is when it's going to be through all of the parliamentary processes that are required for it to be mandatory.
And we criticised for not taking that long to make those decisions. Thank you.
Cool. Any further, we've got the minutes there, thank you Matthew Miranda, you've got the minutes of the Air Quality Working Party on the 8th of May on pages 44, 45. Any further discussion on this Mount Maunganui Air Quality update? There's a resolution on page 33 that we received the report. Would somebody like to move? Councillor White, seconded by Martin Moana. All those in favour, please say aye. And carried. Thank you for that. Thank you, team. Moving on to Rotorua Catchment update. So this morning we've got Alan and Rosemary. Good morning, team. Alan and Rosemary, thank you for this very comprehensive report. For those councillors who need to be updated on Rotorua catchment issues, this is a very comprehensive report. Thank you very much. I was trying to question everything you said there, but there was always an answer in the report. So thank you for the very comprehensive report. Thank you for that. So, councillors, any questions? Just on Okerika Pipeline, is it stable now?
Yes, so tēnā koutou, koe Craig Toponua. So over a couple of weeks ago, when we had some heavy rain in Rotorua, although we've had that for last week probably, we had an incident at the Okerika Pipeline where there was a lot of water flow and there's a construction happening there at the moment where the pipeline's getting replaced, and so the water flow undercut the pipeline, tipped into the overland flow pipeline, that's sort of a temporary pipeline, tipped it into the construction trench and it broke, and so flow went down the construction trench and across some neighbouring land into the Waitangi stream and into the lake. So a lot of sediment was carried with that obviously. So our staff were out there on the Sunday morning that it happened with the contractor, and we've been working to remove the sediment and just stabilise things. So, and we've had iwi and Fish and Game and the landowners and the contractor out there just keeping everyone informed and making sure that the right things happen to remediate that. So yes, I believe we're all on track with that project, with the remediation of that incident and with finishing the project by the end of the financial year. So on track, so so that's good. Yeah, been really good cooperation from all of those parties to get it resolved. So.
Yeah. Councillor Clark.
Yeah, hey,
Councillor Crosby.
yeah, it's a point of clarification for Great Unwashed here. I noticed that you said Tarawera, all the lakes around it are perched above it. Does that include Okataina, or was somehow I had the idea that Okataina was below Tarawera? It's not.
Yes, Okataina, it does. So Okataina is part of the Tarawera Catchment. It's one of the 8 lakes, and yes, I believe it is perched above it.
Yes,
I've got a really cool diagram I could
That's all right. I wonder,
yeah.
just like somehow I had this idea that it was actually, yeah.
I've got a cool diagram I can circulate that shows that. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Anything else you want to report, Helen?
No, so just to take the report as read, but I have got some, if the councillors have got time, I've got a couple of things on some slides. So we recently over summer ran a photo competition to get some ideas of how people in Rotorua enjoy the lakes and what they do on them and get their thoughts about them. So they submitted a photo and a short sort of sentence about why they liked the lakes. And so some of the photos are up here. We had a winner, we gave away a paddle board, and the winning photo will come up shortly. So these are the finalists. There's about 10 or 15 finalists. And then, and so we selected a winner from those, and they won a paddle board. So some really cool snaps there of people using the lakes. I'll wait for the finalist one to pop up. It's Lake Rotorua. So Lake Rotorua, it's getting really well used for recreation at the moment. Must have missed the other one at the winning one at the start, but I had 3 bowls. It's on our Facebook page anyway, so if anyone's interested in looking at those. And then I've got another slideshow that Shari will bring up. So one of the things I reported on in my report was just about the Lake Rotoiti wastewater scheme. So the Regional Council is part funder of that, so is the deed of funding agreement with the Crown part funder of that. And Shari's just going to put up a flyover shortly which shows the extent of that scheme. So this is the reticulation of the east end of Rotoiti. So there's a photo there of the new wastewater treatment plant behind Emery's store, and also some drone footage showing the extent and just the magnitude of the scheme. The construction's underway at the moment. So the reticulation pipes for the scheme are all in the ground. Just the on-site connections need to be made. And both the east end of Rotoiti and the reticulation at Lake Rotomar connects to the new wastewater treatment plant behind Emery's store. Rotomar is connected now, but the on-site connections at Rotoiti just need to be made. So so it's just it's a significant, you can see the challenges of the terrain and the length of the scheme with this flyover. The clarity's not as good as it could be, but it's a significant.
So this is Lake Rotomar?
Yes.
review across the space that plans for immediate public claim district, and the opportunity for them to expand into public claim with the sort of infrastructures that's been completed here.
That's right.
There's a real positive opportunity.
Yep.
And so, sorry, going to the speaking now. Yeah.
Councillor Crosby, did you want to ask your question while we're watching this?
Yeah, either do the team to answer it. Well, the short-term incentives are coming to an end, and then there's a time where they'll be wrapped up. Post that, what's the long-term contingent liabilities for the council? Is it significant or minor?
Sorry for the late Rotorua.
No, the whole incentive scheme.
The whole incentive scheme. So basically we have funding set aside for to fund the incentive scheme, and that has to purchase the amount of nitrogen that it's set aside for. If it doesn't do that, then we would have to find alternative ways to secure that nutrient, that nitrogen.
But let's say post 2032.
Right.
Is there any significant cost to council after that?
Assuming that the targets are achieved. If the targets are achieved, then the idea of that is that we would be able to, sometime in the future after that, cease alum dosing. So that's the idea. So the alum dosing is the ongoing cost for us, and depending on whether those targets are achieved and when we see that nitrogen footprint reduced in the lake, is when the alum dosing would be able to be turned off. But that is a long-term scenario. Yeah.
But monitoring is going to be a big cost to this council, Stuart, in terms of the incentive schemes, all our plantings. Well, yeah, that'll be a biggie. Rosemary?
And I guess we can add monitoring and change 10 in that sense as well.
Yes.
It's probably a bigger cost actually.
Yeah. Shari, there's just a slide with the photo of the Sweetie wastewater treatment plant next along. It's a really beautiful shot, and it's worth having a look at just to see where it is. Yeah, so that's just up behind Emery Store. If you're driving just past Emery Store, there's a road up to the left, quite a very steep road, and it goes up to...
That's fully operational now?
Yes, with the wastewater from Musamar,
Yep.
but yeah, still waiting for Sweetie.
Yep.
Yeah, for the on-site connections to be made. So, yeah, thank you.
Chair?
Helen, can you take me through an explanation of the points made on the top of page 55 in relation to nitrogen loss, phosphorus loss, and the use of overseer? So firstly, the numbers have got to be wrong in terms of bullet point 3, but in bullet point 2, as written there, when you say that the amount of phosphorus loss from rural land has been reduced by 2,000 kilos as measured through overseer, what does that actually mean? Are you saying that overseer has been recalibrated and the original figure has now been reduced to a more reliable figure? Or are you saying that interventions in terms of retainment bunds as measured through overseer have given us that improvement?
So these, just these losses relate to the Lake Rotoihu catchment.
Yeah.
So what we've done is we've looked at the benchmarking data for that catchment. So the benchmarks that were done for the 2001 to 2004 period up at Rule 11. So they were measured in overseer. And then we've compared that against the current losses as a result of the land retirement we've done in that catchment. So we've got 2 significant land use change agreements in that catchment, and also there's also been other changes. And so we've measured, so we've basically modelled the losses in that catchment again, and found that as a result of our work in that catchment, the nitrogen and phosphorus losses to the lake have been reduced from the land.
I'm still not convinced that I understand it properly. And I think we need to.
Right.
So my understanding is modelling through overseer essentially deals with nitrogen. The phosphorus losses are essentially overland flow paths, which physically the intervention is through detainment bunds. interventions have taken place in this catchment to get that reduction? That's the question I'm asking. Or is it a recalibration of the way you're using overseer in terms of the model?
Rosemary is going to help us with this one.
So through you, Mr Chair. At the time of benchmarking, phosphorus was modeled through overseer. So we do have those initial baseline, and even though overseer doesn't necessarily model phosphorus all that well, we do have the benchmark data.
So that's the point I was making, you see, the reliability in terms of overseer.
So
It hasn't got better, has it?
no, it hasn't. But based on the benchmarking data that we hold within council, that's where these figures have come from. To my knowledge, I don't think there are any detainment funds in the Lake Roger catchment.
No.
So it's just come from course modelling, I guess, in overseer.
But there's been significant land use change in the catchment, retirement.
I think, that's sort of the point we're making, and that was the point I intended to make with these numbers, is that we've got some benchmarking data, as Rosemary said, and we measured that using overseer, and then we've got the same measurements with the change land use at this point now, so we can compare the two. And I think overseer is reasonably accurate in doing those comparisons on the same land,
So all that benchmarking data is transitioned through the various versions of overseer, so we are comparing apples with apples in this case.
So supplementary, Chair, follow on from Councillor Crosby's question in terms of contingent liabilities going forward in terms of nitrogen. So if you are, how can I put this, given 2030, if there's no improvement in the lake and you have to go more aggressive in terms of nitrogen reduction, and you've already spent all the money in the incentive scheme, the liability, because you're going to have to wind back the amount of discharge to lake from land use, where are you going to get that money from? Because that's the key question Mr Crosby was asking. So is that going to fall to the regional council? Is it going to fall to a partnership again between the Crown and the regional council? Or are people just going to have to suck it up?
So
as overseer, hopefully, is recalibrated and improved, if you're not getting the in-lake improvements, you've got to do some more intervention on land, right?
I think we're really confident in the 435 tonne. So that's that's the input to the lake, the sustainable input to the lake. So we've got a lot of confidence in that. That's really thoroughly tested, and it's got a large body of science behind it. And we've got a suite of interventions to get to that from the current state. And overseers, it's not a perfect, no model is perfect, but it's very good at looking at the reduction on a particular piece of land. So if you take a current farm system and you put in and you make changes and you have another farm system or another land use, it's good at measuring the change. So because you're in that situation comparing apples with apples. Rosemary will correct me if I'm wrong here. So we can be reasonably confident that when people make the changes on their land to get to their nitrogen discharge allowance, that they are actually achieving that reduction. There's all sorts of other challenges that we face, like climate change, for example, will affect water quality in the lake. So there's a whole lot of things that we will need to adapt to over the life of the program. And what we're hoping to do with this program now is just make a substantial generational change to make things better. But there will be challenges that we'll face, definitely, and we have and we will continue to.
Is there any relationship that's significant between the lake levels and the trophic index and the N and P in the lake? It's kind of the lakes, the summer would probably be a metre general historically lower than they are, and is that a measurable distance, discernible, measurable thing in terms of, well, I guess the concentration levels of effect on the algae blooms when the lake level goes lower?
I think this is not my area of expertise, but generally, if the lake level is lower, you would you've had a long period of dry weather, and that can affect water quality because it can cause stratification of the lake, so you don't get that mixing, that aeration. So that might be a situation. They're probably not. They're probably not correlated, but they might happen at the same time. But they're not causal, but they might happen at the same time. I'm not sure if lake levels alone cause algae blooms. Yeah, it's more about that stratification and deoxygenation of the lake.
And the opposite can reverse as well, because when Ruafakaiti was very high 3 or 4 years ago, there was a reduction in water quality because all the lake edge margins were rotting.
Right.
Because of the high water table, and so you had that input from all the vegetation affecting water quality. So there's no rule around it. But I know Lake Rotorua is still very low at the moment, even though we're in, halfway through winter, and you get these strong winds and it just stirs up the mud, and we know there's a lot of nutrients in that mud that is stirred up and reintroduced back into the lake. So there's no rule of thumb per se for lake levels. Any other questions?
So, Mr. Chair, just to follow up on Doug's question, would your projection be that regional council has to find the money, or would you partner up with another organisation, or the public have to suck it up?
So I think what's happening, I think you're all asking me, is if we don't get the changes in lake water quality as a result of this program of interventions, how do we pay for that? And if that came to that point and we still didn't see an improvement in water quality, bearing in mind that, and those two council are right, that even if we make these changes now and make the 2032, there's an average age of groundwater of 60 years. So we wouldn't necessarily expect, to come to you and say, right, we've got the 320 tonne out and the lake's fine now. It will take a long time for that to reach the lake because the groundwater is so old. But I think what you're asking me is if we don't get, if all of this program of interventions we've got for Lake Rotorua doesn't get the nitrogen out, the nutrients out, who will pay to get the rest out? And I think first you look at what your options are for getting it out. So that is really land use change. And so to make land use change, you've got two options. You can retire land, you can purchase the land and retire it, you can purchase the nitrogen, or you can have a rule to make further reductions. So we'd be looking, I think earlier in the life of the program we looked at other things that we could do around engineering solutions, but I think as we've moved through, really it's about that land use change and that land management change, getting the nitrogen out from the land use activities. So, you've got a rule or you've got someone paying for, the public purse paying for the retirement. So those are the two options, and we'd look at those more closely.
So, Helen,
Yeah.
sorry to dwell on this, but it's really important. So again, sitting behind Councillor Crosby's question is the current discussion that's taking place in the care of Lakes Group, which is diverting money from your incentive scheme into supplementing cost overruns in Radmar, East Radmar. If that occurs, and there is no agreement from the Crown or the other parties to participate in supplementing or putting the money back into the incentive scheme to buy nitrogen, who's going to pay for it? That's the guts of it, isn't it? I mean, I think this council needs really good staff advice in terms of what is that contingent liability if that course of action was taken.
Yes.
It's $10 million.
Yeah. So that's definitely a concern for me. At the moment, we don't have the uptake of the incentive scheme. So we're talking about the last 25 tonne sometime out in the future, and we don't have a pipeline to that. So at the moment, I think I said in the report, we've got a pipeline to 40 tonne, and perhaps a bit beyond that, maybe 50, but we certainly don't have the pipeline to 100 tonne. So that last 25 tonne and the potential $10 million going towards meeting from that, yeah, there will be some implications for us if the pipeline is there, I guess. Yeah.
Sarah?
And through you, Chair, I think the important thing, we've got a critical year point of pause in the program anyway in 2022, which allows us to look at what we've achieved and what's ahead of us. And I think through that process we can look at what the potential options of that liability, managing that liability are and the likelihood as well. So we will bring that through to Council at that time.
Right. And I think there was a letter from Fiona that went back from the strategy group meeting last week. There was a letter from Fiona that went to Jeff that if we are successful in getting the 10 million transferred from incentive money to support the completion of the Rotorua plant, then we would need RDC support to go to the Crown and say, can we get it some other way, shape or form? And that letter from Jeff was said, yes, we will support you. So it all lies on the moment on the Minister for the Environment in terms of that decision, 10 million transfer, 10 million back again. Have you had any word from Courtney? Is it Courtney, our MFE rep? Have you had any word back from her to say when the Minister's likely to make a decision on that 10 million?
I haven't. So they are working on it. We have another strategy group meeting in August,
Yep.
and I'd like to think that they would be reporting back to us then on some indications. Yeah. They have got a bit of a process to work through at their end. So just for clarification, so Rotorua Lakes Council are looking for a further $10 million. They've made a request to the Minister to provide that in addition to the funding under the deed, so that's in addition to what we've currently got in the deed. But as a backup plan, as a plan B, Strategy Group have agreed that we would relook at the allocation of funding under the deed if that request for additional funding from the Minister wasn't successful. And the reality of that would be that $10 million, if that plan B was needed, that would be the $10 million from the incentive scheme. But we're not currently in that position.
Right.
Yeah.
Councillor Ryan?
Confusion reigns, but may have been clarified. Who is asking the government for what? And what authority do they have to do that?
Do you want me to answer?
Okay, yeah, Chris? Yeah.
So the Rotorua Lakes Council has a problem in that their funding for the completion of the Lake Rotorua scheme, as we just showed you the overview of, is the budget is much greater than it that they've provided for, including the Crown Fund share, because this is all part of the defunding. The Crown Fund share is short $10 million, so they're asking the Minister, can we have an extra $10 million to finish off the sewage scheme for the Rotorua? Now, if the Minister says no, but you can use some of the incentives money, which is currently sitting in the regional council side of the ledger for the deed, and I'll top that up later on, then that's the plan B that Helen's talking about. So this has been the subject of discussion at the strategy group because the Rotorua Lakes Council has been seeking support from their partners, being ourselves and Te Aroha Lakes Trust. And that support was successful at the last meeting, although the one before it there was some disagreement. So the first response is, Minister, can we have, this is Rotorua Lakes Council, Minister, can we have another $10 million to complete the sewage scheme? Failing that, can we reallocate $10 million from the regional council share for incentives, which is not needed right now, but will be needed in the future, with the view to topping that up later on, in perhaps 2 to 3 years' time in 2022, as Sarah's mentioned.
So who would be topping it up?
The Minister, the Crown.
Crown.
Yeah. Okay. So the councils have to put in their 50% on top of that as well. So Rotorua Lakes Council have to find another 10 million to match that 10 million. Equally, we have to find 10 million to match the 10 million for incentives should we use it for that, or when we use it for that.
a little strange that we're asking the minister if they can do something with regional council funding.
Well, it has to come back to us as well. They can't just take the money, it has to, but this is a plan B, it's not a done deal. It's only if the minister says, no, I prefer you to do it another way, then it'll come back to this table or the council meeting for consideration by the whole council. That's my understanding of the process. We had the lawyers look at the deed to try and tell us what is the process here. But that's our understanding from the legal analysis.
And to put some numbers behind Chris's address, the rotary scheme has gone from 35 million to 53 million because of a whole lot of issues. And they're requesting, and all through this, the trust deed on the 4 lakes was always 50% from the Crown, 50% from TLAs or Rotary District Council for the sewerage schemes. It was always that figure when we built Okedika, when we did Hamarana, it was always 50-50. So this one, because it's the cost of overrun, it's sort of 70-30, isn't it something like that figure? Is it 70-30? And so the extra 10 million would bring it up to the 50-50, which is what the deed funding has always said right back in 2006 when we signed it. So it's just cost escalation, inflation, construction costs have all been brought to fore through this $53 million price tag for Rotary. Mr. Leader.
We're failing to debate, and this is not the right forum, we're failing to debate the core issue of causation of this. And all those issues you've just mentioned about contractors' rates, the issue here, this program of work was costed.
Yes.
It went out for tender.
Yep.
What we don't know, within that tender document, what were the variations that could have added to it. But in any circumstances, this is doing a capital project which is not reinventing the wheel, it's about digging holes, laying pipes. And when you've gone from, what did you say, 35, 33? 35 to over $50 million, you have to ask the question, where is the accountability for either the estimation, the tender document, and the final cost? And unless someone does that at some stage, if I was in the minister's shoes, I'd say, you come to me with the due diligence in terms of where this went wrong. Otherwise, you're just going to feed this ever requesting hole of money. And at a local government level, including ourselves, I think we need to be a bit more robust in terms of how we oversee some of these projects. Not that we did, because we gave them a grant.
We gave a grant of $8 million towards that
We gave them a
$35
grant of
million.
$8 million. But I think this entity needs to have some refocusing in terms of when you do this sort of grant activity.
Yes.
Is there a responsibility us to have some oversight, some say, in terms of some of these capital project management?
In project management.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, this 53 has only just come out in the last, when did we hear
Well,
that?
this year.
This year, yeah. And we've been building this thing for the last 3. Councillor White and then Councillor Nance.
Yeah, sadly, I certainly agree with Chairman Leader. The blowouts that have been experienced from my experience with Lakes Council are quite a number of them, and that does come down, in my view, to the project management, to the forecasting. There are several blowouts that are not just related to this business, but also to completion of other projects that are manifesting themselves as a problem for the Lakes Council. And you know what they are. Some of the buildings that they're constructing at the moment are blown out by quite a few million. And so you'd have to ask that very serious question that Chairman Leader has posed. What's the due diligence behind this? What's happening? How, explain, please explain.
Yep.
And rather than just put your hand out and say, we've got a blowout, I think that's coming, that demand for explanations.
Councillor Nance.
Thank you. And my apologies if this question has already been answered by an urgent personal matter to attend to. Is there a time limit to when this decision needs to be made on this funding? Is there a clause, a deadline clause that's going to mean that we've got to make a decision by, or they've got to do the work by a certain time?
No, sorry, Chris.
At the last strategy group meeting, the resolution put up by the Mayor was I can't remember the exact wording, councillors were there as well, but it was to enable the district council to let the tender or to select the preferred tender, so that they could have some confidence that the money would be coming at some point in time from somewhere. And if it wasn't the minister. And now I don't know if the district council has acted on that or not, but that was the sense of urgency we had at that time. I'm not sure that they actually need the money right now. They just need an assurance that there is something.
So they have all the consents and it's all ready to
yes.
go?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So
This is the second half of the program.
Yeah, so my question is, what implications does the 3 water reforms have on this? Because this is potentially something that might go into a 3 waters entity, and our money will just be swallowed up within that. So I need to understand those overlapping issues as well, because it might be better for us to push hard, and I was quite cross to hear that Rotorua Lakes had sort of surprised us with this at the meeting, and then our representatives had to make a vote on it, make a decision on it without having recourse to talking to this council, because I just do not think that that's good form. We were a partner, because it backed our representatives into a corner, put us into a different position, and we should be having this discussion before you were forced to vote on that. But the issue for me is that does Rotorua Lakes have the balance sheet that it could fill the gap through borrowing? Because my understanding is that if this scheme goes into a 3 waters entity, then that debt would be recognised and ring-fenced, and that it wouldn't come off our balance sheet. It would be, they would be compensated for it. So there's a lot more to this than just us having our funding at risk. So I'm still of a mind to push back on that, and I do accept Chairman Leader's points about good contract management. I do think that we should be questioning that cost blowout. My position is that it's a done deal now. The letter's gone to the Minister, I presume.
The request.
That the request has gone to the Minister, that should it come back, then we have to be, as a regional council, pushing really hard on being certain that the use of this 10 million is that it's the best use, to be diverted away from getting land use change, if that is even possible, to further subsidising this sewage treatment plant, given what's coming in the 3 waters reform. So I'm just sort of putting that out there, that it's not, I'm not willing to let this transition happen without some strong rigour around analysis and decision making.
From a staff perspective.
Stuart, just confirming, if it goes to the 3 waters reform, the assets and the liabilities are all transferred to this new entity.
The assets are the debts repaid to the council.
Oh, the debts repaid, right.
Look, just quickly, what you're seeing is quite common in civil works at the moment up and down the country, and it's the nature of the type of procurement, the tender, but more importantly, where the risk is shared between those two. And it depends on the nature of the document. I don't know what's happening in Rotorua, but other ones I've been familiar with. It's often they'll have unit rates for soil types, etc., etc. And it's one of those things you don't know until you dig a hole, what the cost is actually going to be. And so I'm quite sure it's all above board, but it's quite appropriate to ask for clarity around what are the drivers for, those cost increases. I mean, Chris is aware with what I'm talking about. It's the same within our stock bank management and all that construction is exactly the same thing.
And the material that went to the Minister, and I've got believe the council were copied into it, did have a breakdown of the reasons why the cost went from the 30 to the 50. It didn't have the detail behind it, but it had a broad analysis of it. And there were a number of reasons, including the increased cost, I understand, of the treatment plant and the road that led to that, and the costs of that hadn't been factored in. They turned out to be quite expensive. So there was a number of those cost increases that do appear to be quite justified, but there was quite a large number as well. So, in terms of the Three Waters implications, I understand staff haven't really looked into that. Is that correct? Yeah. So we haven't looked at that side of things at this stage, so we'll have to look into that. But certainly the first request that Helen assisted Stavros with that went to the Minister was a simple, can we have 10 million more please to finish off the lake reticulation? And it was only after the last strategy group meeting that this additional Plan B idea came out. So I'm not sure that that's been to the Minister or not, but so I think we're focused on the initial request, just the straight 10 million more.
At the moment, yes.
Yeah.
And, sorry, Councillor Neves.
I've just got another question about another matter in this report.
Yeah. So can I just defend Te Taru and I that we're at the strategy group and this was put to us, and I knew it was a two-step process in terms of asking the Minister for 10 million and then it would come back to us. But also I was aware of the optics of this. For a Minister to make a decision like that, I felt it was better that we were all on board as partners to go, because if we'd abstained, if we'd voted against it, it wouldn't have looked particularly good in terms of the optics to the Minister in terms of us making a good decision. So that's why I went with it, that we're all in this together. We've got to finish that scheme. We cannot have half a scheme. It would be bizarre of us to have an $8 million grant and we actually haven't finished it yet because of cost overruns. And we've all seen the report was at the strategy group, Chris, I think, of all the cost overruns in terms of consent compliance, different types of on-site treatment at each individual home as opposed to a normal low-pressure climate pump that's been done in other areas. So, and that was part of the consent that was adopted by the Environment Board. So, yeah, we were put in a difficult situation, but for me, it was, we had to find a way to finish the scheme. And yes, they've probably got headroom on their balance sheet, which would be the first port of call for me. Anyway, that's in my Taru's defence on the day. And it was the mayor who best. Let's put it that way.
I think the emphasis of Andy just to support your comment is that clearly the first effort was ask the Minister for an additional 10 million.
Yeah.
And everybody was okay, we'll go with it.
Yeah.
In the context of the second Plan B, it will come back to Council and will be navigated and negotiated before any of that type of scenario is approved. So, I mean, that in itself is a protection in its own, but actually playing part of the team, because the Rotorua Lakes Trust and the Lakes Council, and then there's us, agreed to that first portion. Personally, I had no difficulties with that. I thought it was reasonable that the Minister was going to say yes. But the second part is a matter for us to debate further.
And Sarah, I think for us around this table, can we have a point 2 on the recommendation on 49 that we actually receive a report from Rotorua District Council on the cost escalations of Rotorua Rotorua in detail, rather than just construction costs and that sort of thing. I just, we're a partner in this, and we were a bit, we heard about the cost overruns at the last minute, well this year, Chris, and to go from 35 to 53, and we're a partner, I thought was in poor management to a partner, quite frankly. So can we, as number 2, can we just see a full report come back to whoever, I'm not sure whether it's this group or whether we have the discussion next time. It might be strategy and policy if we're going to be talking about this in the future, but we just probably need, councillors probably need to see a little bit more detail on the cost overruns of that scheme and the whys. Yes,
Just a full detailed report outlining the cost escalations
yes,
from Brooksville ex-council
Yeah,
on the
yeah. Rotama scheme. And it's in the strategy group minutes now, or the report, but we need a little bit more detail in that was there. You know, you've got that new access road. The reasons why the new access road wasn't included in the cost was they thought they were going to go around a different route, and then the owners said, no, we're not going to allow you to do that. We want to develop our land for Kainga, so they had to put it straight up and over the hill, and that's $2 million. You know, that $2 million road. So, people comfortable with Councillor Nees?
Oh, well, my,
Second question?
yes, well, just raised another question. That will be a local road. So is NZTA going to be asked to fund that, and should that be in the...
Is it a local road? No, I think it's over private property.
Private property, so it'll be a private road. Yeah. Okay, so my other item, and I hope I'm in the right place in the agenda, but the pushwater chair position.
Oh, yes.
That's in this paper?
There was some reference in Fiona's newsletter on Friday about
That's right.
finally advertising it.
Yes, and my question is, this is a grant or a payment that we make every year.
Correct.
We've been without that chair for quite some time.
Correct.
And I just want to know what conversations staff have had about whether or not it's still appropriate that we pay that full amount. Since we've been without a chair and without a functioning chair. I'm sure we're getting research done, I'm sure there's a lot of value we're getting for that money, but we've also been a long time without a chair.
So we're not paying for the chair for that period that position's been vacated. We've just approved it into this last week. So we're still paying for the parts of the agreement that are ongoing. So there's research staff and research costs, but not for the chair's position. But once that person is in place again, we'll start paying again.
So what happens to that funding that we haven't paid? Does that go into the equalisation reserve at the end of the year, or does it get ring-fenced for Rotorua Lakes?
So it's still sitting in my budget, and it will, yes, it's not spent effectively. Yeah, that's about as much as I can answer on that, but I can check with someone about that, yeah.
I would assume it goes into the equalisation reserve.
Thank you.
Councillor White?
No, just,
No? Oh, you're just thinking.
just thinking.
Okay, right. Moving back to page 49, so we're receiving the report on the Rotorua Lakes catchment update, and bullet point 2, Shari, is just read that again.
recommendation 2 is to request a full detailed report outlining the cost escalations from Rotorua Lakes Council on the service.
Thank you. Been moved by Councillor White, seconded by Councillor Brunning. Any further discussion? I'll put that resolution. All those in favour, please say aye. It's carried. Moving on to 8.4, land management focus catchment update. Kaiti Falls and Upper Rangataiki. Thank you, Emily. Thank you. Rosemary. Kim, this is your... Could you introduce your team, please, mate?
Can do. Tēnā koe, Mr Chair, and tēnā koutou councillors. Thank you for your time this morning. Firstly, just would like to introduce Land Management Officer Kendall Smith and the Eastern Catchments team, who looks after the Upper Rangataiki, and Hayden Schick, who's a Land Management Officer in the Tauranga office, who looks after the Waitau Kaiti Falls catchment. So I've got a few slides to show you if you have time, and then if your questions are specific to the catchments, then Hayden and Kendall will be very happy to answer them for you. There's also in the background Jackson Effort, who presented to you in December on the first 2 focus catchments. Right, so as you know, councillors, in mid-2019 you approved a revised version of the environmental grants policy that my team and Helen's team work under. And the change in approach was to become targeted, both for biodiversity work and for water quality work. So previously we had operated under a more generic, call it pepper potting approach, if you like. Anyone who came to us with a good idea would be considered on its merits, and an equal funding grant arrangement would apply irrespective of where that initiative was. In the middle of 2019, you approved the adoption of 430 priority biodiversity sites and the targeting of our grants towards achieving protection and sustained management of those. You also approved a change in the way we apply grant rates to water quality work. So instead of applying the same grant rate everywhere, we identified 11 focus catchments, including the entire Rotorua Lakes area because of the sensitivity there. And those focus catchments would have higher grant rates applied to them where works related to the contaminant of concern in that particular focus catchment. It's not to say we don't have environmental issues in other places, but it's just acknowledging that there are known issues between contaminant levels in certain catchments and the values and objectives that apply. And the intention was that we establish some goodwill and get engagement at a catchment or sub-catchment level with between 1/3 and 2/3 of landowners, and apply a preferential grant rate to works that would address the contaminant of concern. So that's the background. We did say we would come back to you with a review of that policy in 2 years' time, so we're working on that at the moment, and we'll bring that to you at a forthcoming meeting, or perhaps strategy and policy, I'm not sure. I'll look at some guidance on that. The two focus catchments that we'd like to just give you a bit of an update on today are the Upper Taiki catchment and the Waitao catchment. So Shari, if we can grab the next slide, please. Was there a remote control here? So we'll start with the Upper Taiki. So it's the highest part of our region. It's a big pumice plateau. The largest exotic forest in New Zealand, occupies a big proportion of the Rangitaiki catchment, but there is an area at the top of the catchment which is in agricultural production and has been intensified to some extent over the last few decades.
So Pim, just to locate councillors, that's on the Napier Taupo Road?
Correct. That Napier Taupo Road is running through here, State Highway 5?
Yep.
That's right. So the number of landowners that we're dealing with here is relatively small, but the size of the enterprises is huge. So some of the individual businesses operating here, including Landcorp, are larger than entire catchments in other parts of the region. The issue, the contaminant of concern in this area is the nitrogen, in particular the oxidised nitrogen concentration, which is on an increasing trend and is in the worst 15% of sites in New Zealand in one tributary and in the worst 5% of sites in New Zealand in the other tributary. And the issue is that the groundwater concentration at the monitored bores is rising as well. And so it's now at a level where the receiving environment is approaching levels where chronic toxicity effects might be expected. That's according to Rochelle Carter and Keith Hamill, the water quality ecologists who have analysed all of the data.
Just back the bus up a bit. Some of the toxicity levels of nitrogen to the environment, to animals.
To the aquatic ecological values in the stream. In the river.
Question,
Yeah,
Councillor.
could you actually just briefly give us a bit more background on the background? I mean, this particular bit of area would have been relatively uncontaminated 20 years ago, or what were the measurements 20 years ago? Because there's been through this mad-headed dairying phase, really, where stuff was poured on. So if it's taken 10 years to bugger it, how many years is it going to take to bring it right?
I'll defer to Kendall on this, but my understanding is that the groundwater age is relatively short. So we're talking single-digit years. for any change in land use to result in a change in surface water concentration in that catchment. And so you're right that the intensification of land use has occurred over a relatively short period. I guess if you look at the catchment's vulnerability, in other parts of the Bay of Plenty, we are perhaps less worried about nitrogen reaching the NOF bottom lines. We're more concerned with nitrogen reaching levels that the receiving environment can't deal with and causing issues of eutrophication there. And we've been talking about some of those issues with respect to the Rotorua Lakes just now. But in this case, even though we have a moving pumice substrate in the rangitaiki, which makes it a little more resilient to the effects of eutrophication because algal growth doesn't tend to thrive in the bottom, whereas in the cobbled rivers of Hawke's Bay or Canterbury you tend to get lots of algal growth stuck to the rocks and then building up over time. We don't have that because the rangitaiki moves its pumice along every day, and so we're a little bit more resilient. The most susceptible parts of that system to nitrogen levels are actually the hydro lakes. So ironically, some of the targets around reductions, which we still haven't finalised, our science team is still working on that, will be based on the levels of nitrogen that can be tolerated in the hydro lakes before they reach ecological conditions that are of concern. So there's a couple of things there. One is the level of nitrogen in the upper rangitaiki is increasing. Two, the level of nitrogen in the surface water is reaching levels where we would be concerned about its potential effects on aquatic ecology. And three, we're concerned about the rising nitrogen levels because of their effect on the receiving lakes on the way down the catchment.
Yep. Just pause there. Okay. Welcome along to Kendall and Hayden. Councillor Londelson.
Yeah, I just want to get a feel from you, Pam, the nitrogen that enters up at the Taupo State Highway level. What is, with the pumice soils, what is the filtering effect as that nitrogen goes through the catchments down? You know, is there a natural filtering effect like we do if you have a gravelly base of a river? It will do a natural filtration. Do you get that with pumicey soils?
So the attenuation between the bottom of the grass root zone and the groundwater system is quite low in that pumice. We have very, very low organic matter levels.
Yeah.
And it's the organic matter, the carbon, that tends to provide a lot of that attenuation. So in this case, no, a large proportion of the nutrient loss at the root zone is transferred through into groundwater and then through into the surface water.
And it will flow right down the river? It doesn't there's no mitigation on the way?
There will be a small proportion lost through exposure to air on the way down, but no, my understanding, and I'm looking at Jackson here, is that there wouldn't be very much loss there.
But there are a few wetlands being built in, wetlands produce it, don't they? Naturally occurring wetlands. There's some up there, there's some in Murupara going ahead, so there's that will reduce the nitrogen, Andrew, but by and large, once it's gone past the root zone. Just have a number on that attenuation, Pam, because in Rotorua Lakes we work around at 50% between the root zone and the lake. What would be the number?
I can't answer that question off the top of my head. Jackson can't answer it either, but we will come back to you with that.
Okay.
Kendall.
We do actually have an indication that in terms of years, it's potentially around a 3-year attenuation period.
See, Mr. Chair, that compares with the 60-year long term.
60 to 80
for the attenuation in terms of Lake Rotorua.
Yeah.
Which is quite different. Yours is quite rapid. It
Yeah.
suggests a very porous flow through.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess it's a better position to be in, right? So things get worse faster, but they can also get better faster. The good news, and I've focused on the bad news so far, is that that Kendall and Charles have had some really good engagement with landowners recently, and over the last few years have managed to achieve quite a few things, not only in terms of engagement, but with on-the-ground mitigations and work on the systems that are being run there and how those systems might adjust to an environment where lower nitrogen discharges are not only desirable but required. So the idea is that we help with our grant rates to achieve that buy-in, but also to achieve on-the-ground mitigation. So I've got a report card here that I'd be interested in your feedback on. Jackson developed this with the land management officers for each focus catchment, and it just gives us a kind of snapshot of how much money's gone in from council, from other parties, what kinds of work has that money gone into, and then over time we can track those changes along with changes brought in through the Essential Freshwater Policy Program. So I don't want to read out all these statistics, but Kendall, do you have anything you particularly like to highlight here?
I guess just the engagement that we've had with the landowners has been pretty fantastic. We have currently 3 out of the 5 pastoral landowners we have environmental programs with, and we've also previously had one with another landowner. So the engagement up there has been really fantastic. Yeah.
The other thing that Kendall's done is worked with Ag and the managers of each property on an overseer file for the analysis, and that's on page 95 and 96 of your agenda. Those results aren't available for us to share publicly, but they are where you would potentially expect, and the landowners are very keen to address the impending regulatory risk that they're well aware of, and do so in ways that are both financially and environmentally sustainable. So they're working with us on what those options are and how they can get there ahead of the mid-2024 plan change notification and any requirements that might ensue from them.
Councillor Clark?
Yeah. From my notice, we've got 45,000 native trees and 3,000 calibre poplars now. Probably mine thinking, particularly around the Kopi Canal, where the poplars are used in the form of bioremediation. The 3,000 calibre poplar trees, are they there for ground stabilisation or to assist in some form of bioremediation?
Ground stabilisation. Yeah.
There is no function from those. No, okay.
Yeah, we've got some 7 and 8 and 6 land use capability out there on some of the hills.
Okay, thank you.
So even though nitrogen is the key issue, sometimes for engagement purposes we will assist with works that address sediment or phosphorus on those properties in the focus catchments to try and increase engagement and buy-in, which then leads to enhanced willingness to consider alternative systems or mitigations that address the nitrogen issue.
And on top of what Pim was just saying as well, while there is a nitrogen issue, currently the phosphorus levels that we're getting that are coming through in our testing are in the top 50% of the Lumens sites. So it's still really important to manage phosphorus up there and erosion because algal blooms will often really flourish when you get nitrogen and phosphorus issues. So it's also really important to control the phosphorus as well.
Yeah. Councillor Clark?
Yeah, one of the bio buzzwords around today is miscanthus. Is there any opportunity to use that? I mean, it's popping up everywhere now. Is there any serious consideration of upper catchment using that type of bio attraction?
Jackson.
Yeah, it's good for riverbank erosion and some types of hillside erosion, so we could consider it.
Put it on the agenda. The other thing, just to raise before we move on to the next catchment, is the intensive winter grazing requirements of the EDS. This is probably the part of our region that will feel those regulations most acutely because it is quite a common practice up there with a shorter grass growing season. So as you know, there's a 1-year pause on enforcement of those while that industry working group and government representatives try and come up with something else. But yeah, it's definitely something that is being considered up there.
Because they use winter crops.
Correct.
Grazing on winter crops like Swedes and, yeah.
Yeah. That activity will be having a relatively big contribution to the nitrogen losses in the catchment as well.
Yeah. Seen it done.
Right, if councillors are happy, I'll move on to the next catchment.
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you. And that diagram's on page 97, councillors, that Pim was showing it. But yep, Kaiti Falls, Waitoa.
Thank you. So councillors will have heard us talk about Kaiti Falls for too long, unfortunately. And the issue there is not nitrogen, the issue there is E. coli.
Yep.
It's the highest of our monitored river sites, and it consistently fails the Ministry for the Environment's safe swimming criteria. For that reason, it receives quite a lot of attention. To mitigate E. coli, it's a bit of a dark art. There are fewer guarantees and direct links, and part of the reason for that is E. coli, as you know, is an approximation or a proxy for pathogenicity in the water. It's associated with the Campylobacter, which is one of the disease-causing agents. So the relationship between E. coli and Campylobacter is relatively strong, but the relationship between E. coli and some of the other viruses or disease-causing agents is not so strong. And so sometimes if you reduce E. coli, you might not reduce the pathogenicity of the water, sometimes, and sometimes vice versa. It's the best we've got at the moment, without doing a whole heap of other testing on a range of pathogens every time we take a water sample. That's why it's used in the National Objectives Framework the way it is. Having said that, the E. coli rates are too high, and there is evidence that swimmers get sick. It's a very popular place. I don't know if any of our Western Bay or Tauranga councillors have been there, but you can find 60 vehicles parked up there on a sunny Sunday afternoon, with lots and lots of whānau from Ngāti Pukenga, Ngā Pōtiki, and the wider Tauranga community enjoying it. Our objective obviously is to try and get the E. coli concentrations down below the median and single sample and 95th percentile safe swimming criteria set by MFE. And so to do that, there's quite a lot of work going in that Hayden's been doing. Just flip to the next slide. The majority of the work is about retiring the steep and wet parts of the catchment, particularly those parts of the catchment that are above the swimming hole. But we're also doing the wider catchment because people do swim and use the lower Waitoa catchment and Rangatawa Bay for recreation and shellfish gathering. Probably the largest example of work in the last couple of years, and hats off to Hayden for this, was getting an environmental program across the line with Crystal Jones, who's the largest landowner upstream of the falls. And that was possible through some of the co-funding that Council sought and obtained from the Ministry for the Environment and the Ministry for Primary Industries, both immediately prior to and immediately post the COVID-19 outbreak. So, Hayden, did you want to raise any particular highlights from the work that you've been doing up there?
Yeah, I guess the exclusion areas are significant, but the stock aren't in the streams now. Unfortunately, the results came back from the end of summer monitoring similar to what they had been in previous years. But I guess the main factor from that, in my mind, is that there were still stock known to be in those tributaries this year. Going forward, there is no stock in there, or as of next week, in theory, there's another lot of stock that are being sold that are out of those exclusion zones. So next year, in theory, there's no stock in those tributaries that we know about. So it'll be quite telling.
So there's a couple of other issues there. One is the time lag. As with nitrogen, there's a lag through to groundwater. With E. coli, sometimes you get large resident E. coli populations in the substrate of the stream, and not even the top scientists at NIWA can tell us, how long does it take for that to flush out of the system, or how can you accelerate that process of flushing out substrate E. coli. So we expect there to be some lag. We hope it's not too long. If any of you get the opportunity to drive from Te Puke up Te Puke Quarry Road and then down Coyote Falls Road and down Waitau Road, you will see the landscape scale interventions that Hayden and the landowners are working on. It's really obvious now. Anywhere that's a seepage or a really steep zone or associated with a stream, it's not just a metre or two. In some cases, it's 20, 30, 40 metres off the margin of the stream.
Councillor Nees?
Thank you. There's a very interesting figure on figure 5, which is on page 99 of our agenda, which shows that in 2013-14 we had relatively good water quality, and then suddenly it all went pear-shaped. So what actually is driving that? Is that when the land was intensified, or was so it actually was pasture?
Yeah, coincidental or not, there was significant land use change over that period.
Okay, so it bears out what you're suggesting, that it's not anything to do with the other ruminants, the other possums, etc. up in the bush, which I've heard in the past has been an issue.
Yeah. They might be linked together, but there was certainly land use change that had changed in that period that has a lot of these are mitigating factors that we'll be working on.
That's not to say that those forest sources or wild animal sources aren't an issue. They very well could be, just as the Ngāti Wahine tributary of the Wairua River sometimes has oddly high E. coli results, even though it comes straight out of the colonies. And so it's one of those, as I said before, it's relatively hard to understand contaminant. But if land management practices can achieve safe swimming at Coyote Falls, I believe that we now have agreements in place with all of the key property owners, that we should see those results start to improve over the next few years.
And if we don't, do we have a plan B? Is that more intensive pest management up in the woodlands?
That's an option we could explore. The implications are, if that is required to achieve safe swimming, then that has wider ramifications. It's a smallish catchment, so it's not financially unachievable there. It would be significant if we could go down that path.
Councillor White?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I'm just hearing, I've never been to these falls, but I'm hearing it's a popular swimming place and people are getting sick. So that's pretty serious stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming it's signposted, there are, all that sort of stuff is monitored all the time? I mean,
Correct.
it's
So
a
it's-
concern?
It is a concern. There's a permanent warning sign there that the DHB has put in place, the Toitua Public Health, in response to the elevated E. coli levels. It is on the weekly, I think, sampling regime during the bathing season. But that doesn't deter people. It also doesn't deter my family and I. We live quite close by, and I'd still take my sons swimming there, even though it is in this situation, because I feel as though we should be able to do that in New Zealand. And we've had 45 exposures in the last couple of seasons, and three incidents of illness as a result, well, potentially as a result.
So Toitua are constantly monitoring this site?
We monitor it, and we send those results to Toitua Public Health. Yeah. So our data services and science teams.
And they do what?
They collect water samples, and they analyse those in the labs downstairs, and then those results are posted on Lawa. In addition to that, Hayden, together with Rochelle Carter from the science team, have done a whole lot of work sampling the tributaries, both spatially and temporally, to try and work out, are any of the tributaries above these falls higher than others? Are there particular places where we might be seeing point sources? Are there operations, or is there evidence that there's a human or other E. coli? Or is it mostly ruminant? It turns out it's mostly ruminant, and it turns out that it is coming from most of the tributaries above the falls, so there's no real hotspot. But we, you know, as I said, we've now got good wide setbacks from all of those surface water bodies upstream of the falls. Some of them have yet to be planted, but a lot of planting has occurred, and that intervention is expected, you know, through the published literature and examples in other parts of the country to reduce E. coli concentrations in streams. So hopefully we can see that occur in the next few years. Just have a couple of other points, unless there are any other questions related to Coyote Falls? No?
It's not, oh yeah, I suppose it is a question. I mean, you know, because we know this has been going on a long, long time. And we've had a number of reports to this, to our communities. Yes. And it's a huge concern. You mentioned the Tangata Whenua, and you've got Ngā Pōtiki and Ngā Pōtiki. Ironically enough, a national award was given to the people of the river and the residents for the great work they're doing to maintain the quality of the Waitao River. Unfortunately, right next door, we've got the nightmare of the Coyote Falls. And, you know, to me, it just seems to be going on and on and on of resolving. Now, is it a matter because this is no longer a priority on our work program? Is it because the work that we're needing to mitigate what's happening to combat the E. coli and the Campylobacter you talk about? You know, I guess my question, why is it taking it so long? Is it because it is not a priority on the work program, and so it's taking longer and longer to resolve?
So through you, Mr. Chair, the award that was won was in the same catchment, and the award was for the efforts to improve it rather than the outcomes that had been achieved at that point. I would say, if anything, this matter has gone up the priority list. Prior to 2019's Environmental Grants Policy Review, we were trying to, if you like, sell agreements to landowners with much lower grant rates, and we weren't getting the buy-in from some of those key large landholders above the falls. Since you approved the change in policy in mid-19, and with the co-funding from central government associated with the $1 billion Cruise Fund and post-COVID, Hayden's been able to get those agreements across the line and start doing the work that's required. So, does that answer your question? So it's since 2019 we've been able to get those big properties above the falls doing best practice riparian management, whereas we haven't been able to do that for many of the properties above the falls prior to 2019.
So are we looking at an improved situation 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the track? What are we looking at? Ballpark. Are we looking at 10 years?
The physical work is well underway in the area. I guess that's what we can say. We just don't have those lag times to say when the status of the water is going to change. But the physical works, we know best practices being followed in the most part now.
We have asked NIWA and our own science team that same question, and you know, partly because of the E. coli population in the substrate, we don't know how long that process will take. But we know that we're putting the right things in, doing the right things that we can expect over time, and that situation to be better.
So I guess it is, so there's a central government fund that's available for really deep diving into the analysis of E. coli, and Coyote Falls is actually being picked up as one of the sample sites. It's a $60,000 project that's actually really digging down into the E. coli itself, how effective that E. coli is in terms of making us ill, and what the mitigations might be in the future. So we're waiting on that report as well. So,
Councillor Brunner.
As I understand it, the owners of the bush above it had stock in there, or they had leased land for stock to graze, and they had promised to remove those. Have they been removed?
Yep. So I'm in close contact with them. The trouble is they are just so wild, these stock, and there's about between 15 and 20 of them. Next Wednesday is the day that they're supposed to be removed.
No.
Yeah, and that has been pushed out a couple of times because they've broken through fences and they've escaped areas they can't go. They're physically difficult to get rid of. But in saying that because they're in an excluded area right now, so an area that we need to plant, they have to go out, so there's no excuses. And the guy is, the leasee is willing now.
So we're talking about the bush?
Yeah.
Up in the bush?
And we think that that issue is a contributor. So Hayden has been for some headquarters into those headwaters and has photographed, dead cattle beasts lying in the creeks in the bush. So that it is an issue. And hopefully we can bring you some good news on this one in the next year or two. We'll be watching those lower results as closely as anybody.
Because you said it's one of the highest E. coli in the country.
The highest in the region.
In the region, yeah. But it's right up there in terms of across the country, isn't it? It's, yeah.
It's, there's no dairy farming above it.
Yeah.
There's a deer farm and some dry stock farms and some livestock farms.
And we're doing pest control work up there as well, aren't we? Yes. So what are the main pests you're after there?
There's been control, but we know that there's deer and possum up in there.
Yep.
And it's actually been largely run by the hapu up there through their own pest management plan.
It's one of the sites where the Manaaki Kaimai Mamaku Trust and the Department of Conservation's Jobs for Nature funding is focused on expanding pest control. So one of the hubs that they've been talking about is trying to link Tangi Wainuku Kiwi Trust's work with Te Whakakaha Trust on the Te Puki side, including that forested tract down the Otawa Range.
Cool.
Councillors, if you'll indulge me for another couple of minutes, I have two brief issues to raise. One is this one here, that a number of landowners are telling us now that they are worried about taking too many steps towards lower contaminant loss farming systems because they feel they might be penalised as a result of that through a plan change process in 2024 and beyond. And I think I've mentioned this to you in a previous meeting that the Bay of Plenty Federated Farmers also shares that view that they are a little worried about the prospect that the enterprises with the highest contaminant losses will end up better off through a regulatory process. And I've been talking about this with Jackson and with Nikki Green and so on. Are there ways in which we can provide our landowners with a little bit of assurance or certainty that if they move early, if they make some of these decisions to reduce their nitrogen losses substantially now rather than wait until 2026 or 2028 or 2030, will they be worse off through that regulatory process? And if we can find a way to give them some assurance that we'll use, sector averaging or something like that rather than individual property benchmarking data to provide any subsequent allowances to discharge contaminants, my belief is that will increase uptake in these environmental programs on the kinds of system changes and mitigations that we need to improve water quality in some of the focus catchments in the region. So whether council can formulate some sort of resolution that says these are the options that we're considering and these are the options that we're not considering, or something like that. It's not my area of expertise, but some degree of assurance would I think be useful. And one of the things that we're trying to do here is to talk to farm advisors, because some of this nervousness or cautiousness of landowners is coming from the farm advisory sector. They're saying to landowners, be careful about what you enter into at the moment, because you don't want to end up worse off in a few years' time.
Councillor Nees?
I think this is a really dangerous area. We cannot preempt any policy that we might be considering for the future. So I think the best approach would be to try and manage this through farm plans. You know, if they have a farm plan and the farm plan says that they've got some improvements they need to make, then I think we should be encouraging them to take the action with the subsidies that will make it more cost effective for them to take those steps now, as opposed to waiting until it might be regulated later where there may not be any subsidy. And having been involved in plan changes, they are very complex, and we don't want to be out there in the field saying if you do this now then you'll be protected later, because that's not the way the policy setting process works. We will be having to work very closely with Tangata Whenua on what policy provisions are. So I would really like for our organisation to be coming up with something now and giving people some sort of cover against policies that we don't know what they're going to look like.
I appreciate that, and I don't think people are looking for cover, but I think people are looking for the kind of certainty that says, you know, if you're going to use my current level of discharge, can you measure me after we've done this rather than before we've, or can you measure it from before rather than after? Because there have been instances in the past where policy approaches have.
Well, I would suggest that they're better to get their farm plans done now, and then they can prove what they're doing. I think we've got to be very careful about crossing over our policy initiatives.
But we have had examples in Plan Change 10, for example, Keller and bringing in Ewan here. We've got discharge allowances for sheep and beef, generalised discharge allowances for dairy to move down to trees. I mean, if you go early, those figures are still there. It's a range of figures as opposed to a one figure that you shall get to. So I think there has been examples around the catchment we've used before in terms of that policy adoption. So
yes, but they've been under the policy framework, not outside.
Yeah. But those are examples. Yeah. Councillor Clark?
Yeah, Pim, how is this emerging attitude likely to impact and desire to get catchment collectors up and running? Is this going to impact in this space?
No, I think that the appetite for catchment groups and catchment collectives is very strong at the moment. So people are...
But this attitude here that if we get involved in this catchment collective and get it down, you know, they're going to ping us somewhere down the line.
Yeah, there's just a little bit of nervousness at the individual level.
Yeah.
You know, when they sign into an environmental program, do they agree to reduce nitrogen use from 160 to 120 or 110 or 80 now? And is there a risk in doing that if a subsequent requirement to reduce by X% or whatever comes in 2024? So I think there's still a lot of good work going on, don't get me wrong. I just thought I'd raise this because it has come up in a number of conversations with landowners in the reasonably recent past, and my team is saying, oh, it'd be great if we could somehow assure people that if it's now, we'll not see them worse off in a regulatory process. That's all.
Councillor White.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I support what Councillor News said. There's a need for caution. I just want to ask a question. How long has this intensification been going on up here in this particular area? 20 years, did you say?
Oh, which catchment?
This, you're talking about people perceived as a risk of being penalised.
Yes.
In that particular catchment, how long has it been intensive farming?
I think this issue is something that's occurring around the region in different places.
Oh, okay.
And so that time frame on intensification varies. But I mean,
the reason why I'm asking that is the fact that I'd like to think that doing the right thing in the context of the environment is incentive enough. If you're just going to keep doing what you're doing, then I have no sympathy. But if you can actually, make a contribution and do so in the way you farm, your systems, then it's a good thing. I really do not necessarily support the we're going to dig our heels in type scenario if you don't give us these sort of sensitive guarantees we can soften that. So that's my view. I just maybe I'm a little bit harder in that space and saying do the decent thing.
So through you, Mr. Chair.
I'll come back. Sarah?
Through you, Chair, I think the key message that that we have been talking to communities about is that best practice is a great place to aim, and that if everybody just continues to look at what they can do to improve, there's no loss for them at all. They can't go wrong with doing the right thing. 2024 is not a long way away. And we don't have that policy framework, and we're not, we don't even know if there'll be allocations directly at the farm level. So the key message is you can't go wrong in doing right, and we're not that far away from the framework anyway.
Agree.
Thanks.
You said there were two things?
Yeah,
Was
the last one, and I'm not sure if Shari can put this slide up on the wall, but it's completely unrelated. So you can sit back and relax on this one. A week or so ago, we had a significant storm event that caused severe erosion at Waihi Beach and at a couple of other places like Pukahinga.
Oh, king tides.
Yeah, king tides, bit of storm surge, and 9 metre waves recorded at Pukahinga Wave Buoy. And that's about a 1 in 10 year return period event, according to Shane Oman. But what it's done at Island View in the middle of Waihi Beach is it's eroded some of those sand dunes back to places they haven't been for at least 27 years, according to some of the locals there. And today, the wave buoy at Bowentown and at Pukahinga has just climbed in the last couple of hours up to that same level, 9 or so metres. I'm just mentioning it to you. Staff are having a bit of a chat. We met on Friday to have a talk about this, and there may be some engagement with Western Bay District Council. How do we work with these landowners in places where dwellings in particular are at risk? There's one property at Island View, number 65 Broadway, which is now less than 3 metres from the scarp where the dune drops down onto the beach. And that's not a lot of room. So I'm just mentioning it because we obviously have a role in coastal hazards identification and planning. We also have a role through Coast Care. We're trying to help communities do the right thing to build up a resilient dune system. This location in the middle of Waihi Beach is a place that Coast Care hasn't operated for the last few years because it doesn't have the sand in the system to work there. So I'm just mentioning it because there will likely be some conversations between Western Bay District Council and ourselves and some of those landowners about what's the process, what are the
So
options.
just that graph is the wave height you said, right? So right back at the start, I can't see those dates, but that's when the blood moon was on.
24th of May, we had the 9 metre wave recorded at Pukahinga Buoy and a 7 metre wave recorded at Bowentown.
Oh, right, there's another one.
Today, we have, up around the same level. 8.71 at Pukahinga and 6.2 at Bowentown. So it's, I don't require any decisions. I just thought I'd mention it to the Monitoring Operations Committee as an issue.
Isn't that same area where Western Bay brought the seawall?
No, the seawall is further north in the location of, I think, Shore Road and Loop Road. This area in the middle of Waihi Beach is known as Island View, and there are 9 dwellings on the coastal side of the road. And most of the rest of that central part of Waihi Beach, they're back on the other side of the road.
Councillor Brunner?
So, what powers do we have around that? I mean, if something dramatic was to happen today, do we have powers to remove houses, or do we have powers to, tip rock over the bank to shore it up? What sort of emergency powers do we have around this?
My advice would be that that the District Council take the lead in cases where properties were at risk like this, but that our role be around helping communities to identify a dynamic adaptive pathway like the Hawke's Bay Regional Council has done with its community in the Hamawana and Napier coastline, which is what has been eroding for some time. So I think our role is more in the hazard identification and planning space, and also in the community engagement during restoration space, but that immediate property protection area is something that I would suggest that the District Council take the lead on. Chris may, or somebody else may have more information on that.
So are we identifying this as a hazard by what you're telling us this morning? And should we actually be starting to do something now, as opposed to waiting till the water hits the property?
So my understanding is that these properties already have those hazard lines on their in the Western Bay Community District plan.
Coastal hazard lines.
Yeah, it's not new. It's been known about for some time. I think what's new is that the distance between the scarp and the beach and the front of some of those houses is gradually reducing. And so.
So I'm going to go back to my question though, our responsibility of identifying a hazard. Are you saying that's already been done? So it's now the role of Western Bay Community Council to be doing the next step? Or is there another step for us to be taking after identification of an acknowledgement of an existing hazard or potential hazard? I just want to ask, because I don't want, if something does happen and we've sat back, knowing that you've let us know around this table and we've done nothing.
So because this is not my specialty area, on Friday when we met together as a group of staff, we had Stacey Fair there from our regional coastal planner and Mark Ivory from our coastal hazards team and one of the engineers, and that specific question was raised, and the action point was for us to check where those obligations lay and urgently converse with the District Council to clarify them and then take joint action together in an appropriate way.
Sarah, can comment?
Through you, Chair, I guess there's a short-term issue and a long-term issue. The short-term issue is that, and through the events that happened in the storm events, we have been working really closely with Western Bay anyway, so they're fully aware of the situation. Our staff were down at 3 Mile and 2 Mile Creek to support Western Bay in clearing out the sand that had infilled, and so there was some back flooding happening because the water from the drainage canals were getting through to the sea. So Western Bay are fully aware of that, and they have powers. You'll remember, was it at Makatu Town Point where there was a significant erosion and they had to evacuate people and red sticker their homes there. In the longer term, we do have responsibility in identifying natural hazards, and that's through our regional policy statement, and to continue modelling and understanding what those risks are, which we are doing, and we just need to work really closely with Western Bay when we know that there's an issue that's happening in the short term, that's happening outside, it's beyond the modelling that we had ever anticipated, and that is happening.
Okay, Norm, final question?
It's not a question, it's just like to say that from my observation at Waihi Beach, a lot of the plantings that have happened have done a lot of good work. And I was there on the Wednesday afternoon after some of this damage had been done, and you could see that the plantings had quite a stabilising effect or slowed the process down. But it was that following night that the real damage happened, and a lot of it will restore in the lower areas, but this one particular area had very high sand dunes in front of the properties. I don't know what that, 4 metres, 4 or 5 metres straight up the cliff, and then there's a house just within 2 or 3 metres. That's where, in my view, the only solution, well, there's 2 solutions. The houses are removed or moved back, or there's some hard rock or something like that put in place to try and protect them. So I just don't want them to be discouraged about planting. I think it needs to be encouraged, and there will be a lot of regeneration.
Cool, thank you. Okay, there's a resolution on page 93 that we received a report from Upper Rangatahi and Waitara Catchment. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Aidan. Thank you, Kendall, for your reports. Keep up the good work. We want to see, we've pinpointed some areas of interest across the bay, so keep up the good work and let's hope, keep reporting back to